HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Wolf's Revenge by Lachlan Smith. Read by R.C. Bray. Chapter 1. Where's Carly? Didn't she go with you? Did we say she was going with us? Jeannie asked. My brother Teddy and I stood up and began looking in every direction. We were in the cheap seats high in the Coliseum, watching the A's trounce the Devil Rays. Only 5 years old, my niece wouldn't have wandered away by herself. She must have tagged along behind Tamara and Jeannie when they'd gone for food. My mind went to the guy about my age who'd been sitting 2 rows behind us. I'd noted him because he had the look of someone who'd recently been in prison. The popping muscles of his upper body, clearly the result of many hours spent pushing weights, weren't typical for a civilian, nor were the tattoos visible on his arms and neck, the faded colors and gothic lettering of prison art. How easy for him to have noticed the child following her absent-minded mother, and at the same time, the distraction of my brother Teddy and me. I high-stepped over the seat back. Behind me, Jeannie, my brother's ex-wife, like an aunt to Carly, was on the phone, while Tamara, Carly's mother, scanned the crowd. "I'm calling security," Jeannie said. "We've lost our little girl," I shouted to the nearest usher as I entered the cavern-like concourse. I paused briefly to give the man a description of Carly, which he dutifully repeated into his walkie-talkie. Tall for her age at 4'4", light-skinned but visibly African-American, with a narrow face and wide eyes beneath cornrows and beads her mother had painstakingly woven. One thought simultaneously heartened and chilled me. If the man I'd noticed earlier had taken her, this likely was no random abduction. Far more probable was that Carly had been targeted by a man named Bo Wilder. If Wilder had ordered this, it was to send a message, one to my brother Teddy or to me. Wilder had no reason to hurt Carly. Not unless one of us had given him one. Whenever I passed an usher or a security guard, I shouted my alarm about a lost girl. I'd run a near-complete circle of the stadium before my phone vibrated. It was Teddy. "We found her," he said. "A guy brought her back." I slowed to a walk, but only for a moment. Then I began to jog again. My brother, his instincts dulled by the massive brain injury he'd suffered 9 years before, was unlikely to have noticed the stranger who'd been sitting behind us, and even more unlikely now to think back and suspect him. As for Jeannie, I was unsure how much she knew or guessed. I arrived at our section and slowed, trying to look casual as I came down the stairs, my hard breathing reminding me how long it had been since I'd ridden my bike. The man with the prison muscles was there talking to Jeannie. Carly stood looking down at a little mascot doll he must have bought for her. I came down the steps behind them and grabbed the guy's arm. He turned, his smile betraying no sign of the pressure I was exerting just above his massive triceps, his arm as thick around as the leg of a sedentary man, his head shaved bald. I pulled out my cell phone and suggested that Carly pose for a picture with the man. His expression didn't fade as I snapped a series of shots. His hand remained on Carly's shoulder, but his eyes never left my face. He'd already explained to the others what had happened. Now he told me. "I walked up right behind the ladies and the girl," he said. "When I come out of the washroom, I saw her standing there, looking like she was going to start crying any minute. I figured her mom was in the head, but she was too little to be waiting by herself. When I was coming back from getting a hot dog, she hadn't moved. I bought her the doll to cheer her up, and right away I escorted her back here." Teddy shook hands with the man. "Thank you," he said with relief. "Don't mention it," the guy told him. "Call me Jack." But even as he addressed Teddy, his eyes returned to me, communicating a wordless message none the less brutal for being indecipherable. I shot Jeannie a look. She frowned, her warning instinct aroused, but she seemed not to know what to do. None of us did. Carly was fine. Nothing, it seemed, had happened. So Jack reclaimed his seat behind us, and we all sat down and resumed watching the game. After 2 innings, Tamara was still restlessly stroking her daughter's hair. Like his wife, Teddy was silent beside me, often reaching up to touch the child's arm or shoulder, as if reassuring himself she was still there. "Don't blame yourselves," I wanted to tell him. "It wasn't your fault." I knew, however, that any reassurance I could offer would be hollow. It's an objective truth that no parent can watch his or her child every minute. Kids need freedom, at least within certain boundaries, and most parents' attention occasionally lapses. The thing is, 99% of the time, nothing terrible happens to the kid. Teddy and Tamara weren't most parents, however. They'd met when both were residents in the same brain injury rehabilitation clinic. There, they'd been tasked with relearning how to live on their own, how to dress and feed themselves. Teddy had been shot in the head, and though he'd already made a recovery beyond all reasonable medical expectations, his chances of ever being able to live on his own still had seemed slim. Tamara's brain had been ravaged by a virus, leaving her without the ability to form new short-term memories. At a time when they were each scoured shells of their former selves, they'd fallen in love. Defying their doctors' prognoses, the couple had achieved a remarkable, shared self-sufficiency. Teddy, whom we'd once feared would remain bedbound and speechless, had even regained his law license, though he would never again try a case in San Francisco's criminal courtrooms. Tamara now made a modest living as a children's book illustrator and graphic designer. They owned a small cottage in Berkeley, purchased with settlement funds from a case I'd filed for Tamara in 2003. Though they'd learned to care for themselves, that didn't mean they were qualified to raise a child, but who was? They'd proved excellent, if occasionally forgetful, parents, rising to their newfound responsibility. Still, there were lapses that gave us pause. Even now, if I was honest with myself, a nagging doubt remained in the back of my mind. When Carly became older, a teenager, maybe it wouldn't matter that her dad couldn't navigate the Bay Area's freeway system, or that her mom had little ability to recall events she hadn't written down, yet the simple fact was that their impairments weren't going to improve much more, if at all. I kept expecting the old Teddy to step out of the new Teddy's shell, but that person was gone forever. Among the four of us, I was the only one who suspected that this incident almost certainly wasn't their fault. The stranger, Jack, had cut Carly away from her mother and Jeannie with the skill of a wolf working the herd. That's all we were to these people in the end, sheep good for shearing while the season lasted. When the time came, we'd be led to the slaughter without a second thought. After the sixth inning, I rose with the excuse of getting another beer. Normally, my brother would have joined me, but now he had no interest in leaving Carly's side. She was bent over watching a movie on Jeannie's phone, while the rest of us stared down at the field, pretending to follow the game that in the space of an hour had lost much of its meaning. When I reached the top of the steps, I glanced back and saw that the man who'd called himself Jack had also risen. I waited at the top of the stairs, but he passed me without a glance. He was about 5'9", wearing a Giant's windbreaker and a pair of cargo pants, and on his feet, Vans. I fell in step behind him, drawing from him a quick, disparaging, over-the-shoulder look. We walked together until we came to an area where there were no people around, a part of the stadium in which all the concession stands were closed and shutters, adjoining one of the deserted sections of stands. As soon as there was no one around, he grabbed my arm and slammed me against the concrete wall. He pushed his face close to mine, and I felt his hand crush my balls. "You want to squeeze my arm now, motherfucker?" I was in too much pain to reply, my guts churning. Such men, having burned my office a year ago, had already proved they'd use any means at their disposal to intimidate and control me. He let go, and I sagged against the wall, coughing and gasping. "My niece is off limits," I managed to say. "You have a problem? Take it up with me." "Somebody's under the impression you're not getting the message. Then maybe somebody had better spell it out." "Okay. How about that deal you made for that kid last week? He snitches on some year-old murder, gets 2 years? What the hell?" I'd broken a sweat. "It wasn't connected with Wilder's business. How would you even know that? Because if it had been Beau whom the kid agreed to testify against, I'd be dead instead of playing this bullshit game with you." I pushed myself off the wall, and as well as I was able to, stood facing my assailant, but I had no illusions about my chances against him in a fight, fair or otherwise. He studied me for a moment, then gave a laugh. Fucking lawyers. That's right, I'm a lawyer. And these people your boss sends me are my clients, and I'm going to do right by them. Someday he might appreciate that when a person he actually cares about gets jacked. You, for instance. Don't worry, he doesn't give a shit about me. Be that as it may, if Beau's got so little trust, maybe he ought to just fire me and find some other lawyer. He's got other lawyers. You think you're special? I heard he fired one once. It wasn't pretty. They found him a week later in his office hanging from a light fixture. His suicide note mentioned a problem with booze. Might suicide have taken the life of this nameless, and I hoped imaginary lawyer? I doubted it. Threats don't impress me, I said. I couldn't make any of Beau's people talk about his business if I wanted to, believe me. None of us has any interest in telling stories to the DA. My clients want to live. I want to live. That goes for my family, too. So if you or Beau messes with my niece again, you'll do what? He was entertained, seeming interested in how far I'd go. You're in a position to make threats? Never mind. I'll tell him myself. This seemed to get his attention. You stay the fuck away from that prison. He don't need you on his visitor list. Your value is that you maintain a legitimate law practice with no obvious connections to the other side of the business. Staying legit is the only way you're any good to Beau. I'd say my client list makes it pretty obvious whom I work for. Who you gonna represent, the Boy Scouts? Beau and I did 5 years together. Otherwise, I'd have just come to the office, made myself at home. Don't bullshit me. Beau sent you to grab Carly just to prove he could. You know what? Now there's a police report on file. There's video evidence putting you 2 rows behind us. Those people in the stands are going to remember your face. What was Beau thinking, pulling a stunt like that? A flicker of alarm in his eyes tipped me off. Beau wasn't thinking, I said, pressing what I saw as an advantage. This was you. All you. Acting alone. Getting smart. Thinking how a thug thinks. Only, the way I understand Beau's business these days, thugs are the last kind of people he needs. He's trying to go legit because he's in prison for life. Meanwhile, you clowns are out here running around doing whatever comes into your head, making it up as you go along. He stared at me with continued hostility but didn't interrupt. Someone really ought to explain to him how a stunt like this can blow back on you in ways you can't predict. Imagine if the cops had been a little quicker on the draw, or if we'd freaked out when you brought her back with that doll you bought her. It's messes like this that can bring down an organization. I was aware of saying too much, the way I always did when I felt I was in danger. He waited as if to make sure I was finished. Listen, Beau sent me to deliver a message. I delivered it, and you heard me, right? The message is, no snitches unless you clear it first. This guy, last week, Beau would have said okay if you'd checked with him, but you know how he is. He gets word one of his guys has cut a deal, and the first thing he imagines is there must be some secret angle, that his lawyer's trying to fuck him. If that's the case, I don't see how he ever gets a decent night's sleep. He shook his head. I already said we were cellies for 5 long years. I had his back inside. Now I've got it outside, and he's got mine. I'm the one who's got to keep the troops in line. He paused. The last thing Beau needs is for him and me to get sideways. He stared hard at me. But if you tell him what I did, why shouldn't I? I wanted an apology as well as future assurances. If you tell Beau about this, he said, stepping close. His face was an inch from mine. I stood my ground, not daring to move or inhale. At last he released a cigarette-stale breath. I think you got the message now. Chapter 2. When I returned, the others were standing, ready to leave. Carly's face now was tear-streaked. Tamara was trying to comfort her, but she kept pushing her mother's hands away. Then, as I came down the steps, she broke from her mother and wrapped her arms around my legs. We rode the Bay Area Rapid Transit train from the stadium back to the stop nearest Teddy and Tamara's place in Berkeley, where Jeannie and I had left our cars. I now lived in the city, San Francisco, that is. Rents were cheaper in Oakland, where I'd been based during my first stint in private practice, but I'd been born and raised in Potrero Hill, a formerly working-class neighborhood above the old Navy Yard. After leaving the public defender's office last year, I decided to open my new office near the intersection of 7th and Mission, not far from the Hall of Justice courthouse. Still, I spent a great deal of time in Berkeley with Teddy and Tamara. I was there for dinner at least once per week, often even spending weekends with them, helping ferry Carly to her various activities, t-ball, ballet practice, preschool birthday parties. Soon, life was to become even busier, with Carly set to enter pre-K. We said goodbye to Jeannie, who was heading back to Walnut Creek. Even an hour after my encounter with Beau's foot soldier, my hands were still shaking as I strapped Carly into the back of my aging Saab. I'd picked it up used, and recently added the car seat. Lately, I'd been leaving the thing permanently installed. I figured being an uncle was the closest I was ever likely to come to fatherhood. Each time I got in my car for the lonely drive across the bridge after a visit like this, I felt as if an elastic band still connected me to the place I'd come to think of as a second home. Now, as we approached their house on Gilman Street, I felt a familiar tightening between my shoulder blades. "Want to come in?" my brother asked, as he always did. "Yes, come in," Tamara said, but only after a pause. On a normal day, I'd have taken my cue from her tone and departed. Today had been anything but normal, however. The three of us needed to talk. Carly was overtired, resisting her bath. Teddy, who'd begun to help her, was forced to turn her over to her mother, the only one who could reason with her at such moments. After reviewing the available options in the kitchen, I shuffled through a pile of delivery menus and settled on Chinese. There'd been a time when I might have said what I needed to say to Teddy in the privacy of the kitchen, leaving it up to him how much to share with Tamara. But in my mind, Teddy was a main part of the reason we were in this situation, and so I waited until after we'd eaten, enjoying Carly holding forth as usual, the goofy center of attention. She wanted me to read her a bedtime story, so I did, then yielded my place to her mother, who spent a quiet 15 minutes lying down with her. Then, when she came out, the three of us sat in the kitchen, Tam working on a glass of wine, Teddy and I nursing after-dinner beers. They each seemed to anticipate that I had something to say, Tamara looking at me with open defiance as if expecting me to blame her for losing Carly this afternoon, an event she'd no doubt memorialized in the notebook she carried everywhere with her for this purpose, and readying her response. Teddy looked sheepish and ashamed, unable to meet either his wife's eyes or mine. I showed them the picture on my phone, the dude calling himself Jack, standing with his hand on Carly's shoulder, Carly holding the mascot doll he'd bought. Even now, in bed, she still had the doll clutched against her chest. Jack's eyes were fixed on the camera with their secret message just for me. "This man kidnapped Carly this afternoon," I said. Tamara gazed at the phone as if she were seeing the picture for the first time, then looked up at me in apparent confusion. "He brought her back. That's what I wrote down. She got lost, and a man bought her a doll and brought her back." "Why?" Teddy, having already accepted the truth, looked braced for the worst. "Because last week I pleaded one of Wilder's guys to a deal that involved him giving testimony in a murder he happened to have been a witness to. Today's scare was Wilder's way of reminding me who's in charge." Tamara had risen from her chair like someone obeying an inaudible command. Without a word, she walked past me, through the dining room, and into Carly's room, leaving the door ajar. I heard the creak of bed springs, then a pair of gasp-like sobs. Carly's incredibly deep, slow breathing continued without pause. Teddy and I spoke in lower tones. Did he tell you this when you left us? He wanted to know. Instead of answering his question, I brought up a topic I'd waited far too long to mention, a failing I was resolved to remedy now. You and we never talked about why I left the public defender's office. You always spoke about going back to private practice. I figured you were ready, that it was just a matter of time. It must be obvious to you that I've been repping Wilder's crew. You think I'm doing that by choice? What are you saying? I'm saying I left because Bo threatened Carly. About 6 months ago, he sent a guy from jail to take the place of one of my clients. The one who showed up did a number for me on Carly, where she goes, what she does, her weekly routine. They even knew what books she had on her shelf beside her bed as if they'd been in her room. The message was clear: go back to private practice and work for Bo, otherwise she gets hurt. Teddy looked at me sadly. You never told me this. I didn't want you to feel responsible for my choices. But I did hold him responsible, as he must have known. Until 4 years ago, our father, Lawrence Maxwell, had been serving a life sentence in San Quentin for murdering our mother when I was just a kid. I was the one who'd found her body when I came home from school one day, and I'd spent most of my life believing him guilty of this crime that had irreparably tainted my life. It turned out, however, that he was instead the victim of misconduct by a prosecutor who'd sent more than one innocent man to jail. Although Lawrence's conviction had been vacated, he was required to stand trial again for her murder 21 years after the fact. At that point, a jailhouse snitch had come forward claiming our dad had confessed to him on the inside that he actually had killed his wife, making a return to prison look likely. Next, however, this snitch, an ex-con named Russell Bell, turned up dead. Without his testimony, the present-day jury voted for acquittal. The party responsible for the witness's murder, as it turned out, was an inmate named Bo Wilder. He'd protected Lawrence on the inside while the two of them were serving their life sentences. Now, because of this favor, Wilder expected our father to dedicate his freedom to working for him on the outside, serving as a check on greedy associates Wilder couldn't afford to trust. Lawrence proved an able and willing consigliere. But Wilder also needed legal representation, ostensibly to handle the legitimate side of his business, which he hoped to expand. Over the years, he'd invested the money he made off drugs, guns, and prostitution in real estate, with the result that he now owned 6 apartment complexes badly in need of a steady managing hand. Lawrence, in turn, had recruited Teddy, who, desk-bound by his impairments, a far distance from the courtroom force he'd once been, was struggling to make ends meet. Seduced by the promise of making easy money while keeping his hands clean, my brother allowed himself to be recruited. Probably Bo had intended to rely on Teddy in the same way Teddy's former client Ricky Santorez once had done, but he'd soon discovered that since the shooting, Teddy's legal abilities were limited to serving wrongful detainer suits. Given the situation, Bo had turned his sights on me. "We need to call Dad," Teddy said. "I think he's meeting with some people in the city tonight." I heard the bed springs creak again, then Tamara appeared in the doorway. She wiped tears from her eyes. "No," she said forcefully. "We need to call the police." "I don't disagree with you, in principle," I told her. "I've been wondering all day if the time has come for that. Here's the problem. Bo had Russell Bell killed. Lawrence is the one who benefited from that murder, and the police suspect he was involved. Going to the cops now means coming clean about the role the three of us have been playing in Bo's organization. They'll naturally assume this relationship was in place before Bell's murder, that we were in on the conspiracy to murder Russell Bell to prevent him from testifying, but that since then we've had a falling out, not an uncommon event in a syndicate like Bo's, and that's why he grabbed Carly. We'll be charged with murder. Bo's already in prison for life. He's got nothing to lose." Tamara took out her little book and jotted a quick note. When she closed it and looked up again, it was with the shocked expression of someone waking from a bad dream into a reality that was somehow even worse. "I'd better call Dad. Teddy said, repeating what he'd said a moment ago, as if he thought our father could make everything better with the wave of a hand. No, I agreed with Tamara. Not until we've talked this through. We can't ever have a repeat of today, and threats are the only kind of power Bo knows. We first need to agree on our next step. Then we'll tell Dad what we've decided. Teddy now turned his anger on me. When something comes up, Dad's the one you always look to blame. Even after you've been proved wrong about him time and again, you still don't trust that he's got our best interests at heart. If I blame him, it's because he deserves some of the blame, I replied. You would never have gotten this deep in bed with Wilder if Lawrence hadn't been leading the way. I'll always blame him for that. Teddy's face showed his outrage at my defection. Tamara had never been eager to accept Lawrence into their life. You're talking as though you're the ones who get to decide, she said from the doorway. She was right, of course. Out of all of us, she and Carly were the only ones who hadn't done anything to deserve the mess we were in. They were the innocent victims. At all costs, we needed to protect them. Of course, that was precisely the thinking Bo had used to lure me this far. Tamara went on. When things turned bad last time, after your office burned, Lawrence left the country. He stayed away until he thought it was safe to come back. She held up her little notebook. I've got boxes and boxes of these, filled with the most horrible memories of waking up in a panic every time the neighbor's cat jumped off the fence. All through the worst of that time, your dad was on vacation. After our father's acquittal, Bo Wilder had sent me a message I'd refused to accept. I'd had no intention of becoming an enabler of organized crime, a role in which my brother had seemingly thrived before paying a near-ultimate price when he took a bullet in the head. As a consequence of my turning down Wilder's proposal, he'd ordered my office burned. No one had been hurt, but the message was clear. I could choose to make my living through him or not at all. Caught between the two dangers of the police who wanted to arrest him for Russell Bell's murder and Wilder's rougher sense of justice, my father, just as Tamara had said, had fled to Europe with his wife Dot. There they'd quickly run through the proceeds from his wrongful conviction settlement. Meanwhile, I'd gone for a time to work in the San Francisco Public Defender's office. Slow learners, Wilder's crew eventually had seized on a more effective means of intimidating me than arson, threatening Carly in the manner just described. Teddy rose from the table and took his wife in his arms. They held each other for a moment, and then she pushed him gently away. "Tell me what you're going to do to end this," she said. When her husband couldn't answer, she turned and walked across the dining area into the master bedroom. I heard a closet door bang open and the thump of a suitcase hitting the floor. "Tam!" Teddy called, and he went after her, tugging the bedroom door closed behind him. Still, I heard their murmured voices, Teddy's pleading, Tam's alternately accusing and agitated. Not knowing whether to stay or leave, I went into Carly's room, leaving the door open, and lay on the rug beside her bed. There in the dark, I marveled at the great drinks of air she sucked in, as if the motive force came not from within herself, but from something outside. I could make out the sound of her parents' discussion 2 rooms away, but not what they said. Presumably Tam wanted to leave, and Teddy was talking her out of it, because where would she go? To her mother in East Oakland, where Wilder's thugs could get at her even more easily than they could here? I must have fallen asleep, because I awakened with a start, momentarily fearful and disoriented, to find the house still and cold, darkness showing beneath Carly's closed door, the night sounds beyond the window telling me no one was awake. Someone had thrown a light blanket over me and shut the door. In the bed, Carly slept on. I kept telling myself that I'd rise in a moment and let myself out of the house, then drive back to the city. But before I could carry out this intention, I slipped again into a deep and dreamless sleep. When I woke the second time, the window had just started to brighten. On the bed, a few inches above me, Carly lay on her stomach, staring into my face. She smiled as I opened my eyes. Then she gathered her knees underneath her and launched herself off the bed onto me like a wrestler leaping from the ropes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?